Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Mazda Motorsports Moments, episode number 6. I'm your host, Tony Laporta, and today we continue our trend of going a little bit behind the scenes to learn more about Mazda Motorsports and its lineage. Today, we're going to talk to Ken Sayward from Mazda Design, as well as Julian Soul from Multimatic, and talk about how they took the Mazda design from the production level and turned it into a race-winning machine in the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. So, Ken, when you look at all the Mazda production vehicles that are out on the road, I imagine it would be pretty cool to be sitting at a stoplight and see a CX-9 or a Mazda 6 pull up and know that you had a large hand in making that car look the way that it does. Here at Mazda Motorsports Moments, we're talking about the beautifully designed RT24-P, the pair of Mazda DPIs that race around Daytona, Sebring, Long Beach, Road Atlanta. What was the call like for you when it was time to work on designing that RT24-P?
For us and myself specifically, I go back a long way in motorsports. I got into car design because I was fascinated with race cars as a kid, and that's kind of what inspired me as a kid. So throughout the years, we've had a lot of great projects at Mazda. To have the opportunity to get involved in a race car program obviously was sort of the holy grail for us. So we hit it pretty hard. I think there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm amongst the team to do it. It kind of allowed us to step away a little bit from some of the production requirements. So for us, it was a golden opportunity to really kind of push ourselves at the same time as designers meet the challenges of designing a car with aerodynamic requirements and packaging requirements, performance requirements that were very tightly controlled in a sense. So for us, it actually was a good challenge for us. It was exciting, but also we knew we needed to stick to some very clear criterias and parameters. And ultimately, for me, the best looking race car out there is the fastest and the one that's most successful. So that was kind of the brief to the team: was it's got to be a great looking car, but we also have to respect the engineering requirements that go into it as well. Like I said, I got into motorsports and race cars as a kid. I loved the way they looked. That's kind of what inspired me to be a designer. And as I got older, I've been following, in the old days, following Formula One in the United States was a bit of a challenge because nobody really covered it. But I used to peruse the New York Times to get qualifying times from Grand Prix in Europe and stuff. So I've been into racing since I was a kid. Obviously, one of the attractions to me of Mazda was obviously even when I started 30 years ago, our rich history in motorsports. So that was a big draw to me. And I think for me, that's one of the great things that I can take something I'm passionate about besides cars, but motorsports, and do it at a company that's passionate about motorsports. And like I said, we had a rich history even prior to me joining Mazda. And obviously, in the last 30 years, between the Le Mans win and some of our IMSA prototype wins and MX5 Cup, as well as some private work that I do some racing on the side with NASA and SCCA and Spec Miata, as well as some of the opportunity I've had to drive if you guys know our famed heritage collection of race cars that we keep within the R&D basement. I've had the honor of being able to drive those at certain historic events. And so all of it kind of came full circle. Obviously, the passion I had for motorsports and cars when I was a kid, and then to be able to work for a company that's kind of steeped in the motorsports tradition and that's passionate about motorsports, and then being able to drive our historic cars. And then the final icing on the cake is to be able to design some cars that we run here in the United States in the IMSA series.
So I just got to ask, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to, but if you have, what's it like to get behind the wheel of one of those rotaries and put it down on the power? What's that like?
Driving, I will say the first time I got in, I started with the 767. I did some testing in our 787, and it's an honor to drive it. So it's a lot of cars, so there's a lot of nerves involved in the beginning, making sure you don't ball it up or anything. But yeah, the power is phenomenal. The cars handle really good. Obviously, we have like older spec tires, but new tires. Driving it at the historic races, we don't have to necessarily take it 10 tenths, but the opportunity to drive that, as well as, like I said, the 787, and also just the RX-7 GTO car was amazing. What's interesting is like each generation of cars has a very different feel to it. We have an MX-6 that we drive that's just all grip. I mean, it's got a lot of power, but it's got a lot of tire. Whereas the prototypes have a little bit more downforce. I've driven the 792, which was the IMSA GTP car, and that just has gobs of downforce. So they're all super powerful with the rotary engine, tons of power, far more than I'm used to in a spec Miata. But the amount of downforce and grip in the cars is pretty phenomenal. So great experience. We did a historic race with SVRA at Kodo a couple years ago, and that was a dream for me. It's a great track. I've driven it on the video games with Formula One, and to actually be out there being able to tear it up on the actual track was pretty cool.
Julian, thanks very much for calling in and joining us. We understand it's a little bit later in the day over in England. We appreciate you taking the time. I know you've been a part of Multimatic for quite a while now. If you could explain to us your position within Multimatic and what it is you do a little bit more specifically.
I'm chief designer at Multimatic, looking after most of the motorsport design activities. I actually joined Multimatic 8 years ago to the day, actually. It was today that we joined with a group of other guys from Lola. When Lola went into administration, a group of us joined Multimatic, the design team, carrying on initially with some of the Lola work, including working with Mazda on the Lolas, and then moved on to other projects, and obviously more recently the project we're talking about with the DPi car.
So when we look at Mazda Motorsports and Multimatic together, it's been a pretty successful union, I think a lot of people would say, especially back in the summer of 2019. We kicked off these Mazda Moments shows by looking back at the 3 wins in a row that Mazda Motorsports locked down at Watkins Glen, Canadian Tire, and then Road America. Multimatic plays a big role and is going to play an even bigger role moving into 2020 with taking on the race engineering. What can you tell us about the relationship that Multimatic shares with Mazda Motorsports?
We've always had a strong relationship with Mazda Motorsports. Going back to putting the diesel in the Lola car as it was then, and then building on that, and then, as I say, moving into the DPi project, which was an interesting learning curve, building up and improving the performance of the car through 2018 and then into 2019, when we finally got that first win, and then closely followed by another 2 wins straight after, which was really, really good.
I think people that follow Mazda Motorsports today are familiar with the term Kodo design, but if they're not, what is it? Can you speak to Kodo design? Obviously, in the design office yourself, it's something that's a part of your day-to-day life. What is Kodo design, and how does it play a role in designing not just the production car, but the RT24-P and the other race cars Mazda puts out on the track?
For Mazda, obviously, Kodo is our underlying design philosophy. So every vehicle we build is based on this Kodo philosophy, which is really what we call like soul in motion. And what the idea behind that is that our vehicles, even when sitting still, look like they need to be moving, that they have kind of a life to them, that they breathe, that they look like there's an energy built up in the surfacing that looks like the car has forward momentum. So, when we started Kodo in our last generation of products, we were bringing movement and form and surface and rhythm to the movements. And as we evolve Kodo, we still have the same philosophy, but we simplified the movement. We call it like a one motion. And we've seen that in some of our concept cars, the RX Vision and the Vision Coupe, as well as our recent production cars, Mazda 3, and now recently our CX-30. So the idea is to play with light and shadow, which helps give the surface some life, gives it movement, and kind of more of a kind of holistic view where your eye doesn't stop. When you're looking at the front of the car, your eye naturally goes to the side of the car and to the rear of the car. And that's what kind of gives it this movement. We keep the details pretty simple. We try to be very pure in our design statements. We're all about, it's kind of a pyramid. We start with proportions. So if you don't have the right proportions, kind of doesn't matter what you do after that. So we're really focused on good balanced proportion that we call mass control. And then the next step is the surfacing, the Kodo surfacing, which is all about movement, light and shadow, giving energy to the forms. Also, the way we do it is a little different than other manufacturers in that we do a lot of our clay model work, which is how we develop the actual 3D property, with clay modelers or master models. We call them in Japan Takumi modelers. And they're able to sort of feel the surface and the movement of the surface in the way they move the tools as they go over the surface to create them. So that does it does bring some kind of human element to it, and it brings a life to the surfaces that you really don't get when you do it on a computer. So for us, that's an opportunity to really bring this kind of craftsmanship and this human element to it. And a lot of that is the Japanese craftsmanship approach, is that human touch, giving it life and giving it some beauty. And that's really what's inherent in all our products. Again, whether it's a MX-5 or a CX-9, all of it has sort of that same underlying philosophy. So the two items are proportion and then surface, and then the final item, that's sort of the icing on the cake, is the details. We put a lot of attention to the details, whether it's the wheels or the shape of the taillights or the headlights or the inserts of the lamps. These are all elements that have a big impact on kind of completing the picture. So you start with proportions, great surfacing, and then detail.
So you've got this really beautiful design that comes from Mazda with their production cars, and then you guys are able to meld that into a very fast, very competitive RT24-P. What goes into developing a race car once you have the general design? How hard is it to take that really beautiful idea and make it a competitively ready to go race car?
It's yeah, quite an interesting project because to get the styling cues into the car that as the studio don't always go hand in hand with the aerodynamic performance we're looking for. So it's all about working closely with the design guys to try and build in some of that aero performance into their styling cues and getting them to understand the cue, understand where the performance comes from, and then trying to mold their cues into those areas that are very sensitive on the car to get the performance. With this car starting from a LMP2 car, the actual base underside of the car, the side that you can't see, is doing a lot of work anyway. So the performance, the downforce that we're trying to produce, a lot of that performance is already coming from those underbody surfaces. But then when you add the styling cues or a new beautiful body onto the top of the car, then that brings its whole new set of challenges. Obviously not only getting the aero performance to get the downforce and the drag out of the car, but also the cooling package, brake cooling, engine cooling, oil and water, and on the Mazda, the turbo system as well, the charge cooling, all bring their own challenges that you need to try and build into these surfaces. So very much an iteration working with the design guys.
Obviously not by mistake that you talk about Kodo being the soul of Mazda. And again, anybody who's a Mazda Motorsports fan thinks soul red. That color means so much to Mazda, whether it's in the design, whether it's in the action. Soul red is everywhere in what you guys do.
Yeah, soul red is a signature color for us. Again, it's a lot of the development behind it was to enhance this Kodo form, to really create super high highlights or bright highlights and super dark, rich shadows. So in some instances, when you look at the car, the highlights are almost white or bright orange, and the shadows are almost black. And the color actually enhances the forms. And we study that when we're designing the cars. We have our color and materials team working with the design team, putting film on the car when we're developing the clay to see what those surfaces can do. And then the color and material team goes back and studies how they can develop the color so it's got deeper shadows to it and brighter highlights.
So my vision of what your office looks like, and tell me if I'm off base here, but I just imagine that it's just clay model after clay model, but all the clay is soul red. Is that correct?
No, as I said, we use a film. So the clay it's just a clay color. We do have a film we use called Dynoc, which we put on the clay to show the reflectivity when we do design reviews. We do have a soul red Dynoc, but unfortunately, the way the color's developed, it's kind of a 4-stage paint or 4-layer paint. It's very difficult to do it in a vinyl or non-painted. So I would say that's one of our challenges a little bit with the race cars is we, just because of the nature of racing and replacing body panels and things, when you paint soul red, you need to paint the whole car. And so all the body panels need to be together. And sometimes in a race team, you're painting the front clips, you're painting 3 of them, and then you're painting the rear clips. So it's very tough to match the color. So from a efficiency standpoint and just by the nature of racing, we decided to use a vinyl for our colors. We're starting to look into painting them, but that's our only challenge. Is we wish the Soul Red was darker and brighter, but we think we've done a really good job matching the color. But inherently within our design studio, we have mainly clay color cars. And just a little trade secret, we always review our designs in silver because it's the least polarizing color, and it also highlights the shape and the surfaces really well.
So Ken, you look at the beautiful cars that Mazda pushes out to go out on the road, they're production vehicles, but then you have to have this competitive race car. What's it like working with Multimatic Performance and taking this artful design and making it a race car? Just the compromise there had to be pretty intense.
I mean, for us, when we set out on the project, like I said, we knew we had parameters we had to meet. But when you start a program like that, the first goal is to free the guys up to be as creative as possible. So we didn't want to put any restrictions other than the basic package, the wheelbase, the wing location, the canopy. We knew these things were fixed. So we then had the guys kind of really push it to get the essence of Kodo in the surfacing as much as we could, as well as the front signature wing and the front face of the car. So that was the first step. The process working with Multimatic really was very good for us because, again, it taught us a little bit of discipline as far as aerodynamics, and working with them through computer and remotely. And then we even sent our designer and our digital modeler to England to work with them hand in hand. So that really kind of sped up the process for us than doing it in California and having them give us input from Europe. But then we realized to meet the deadline and to have both sides getting what they wanted and not compromising too much was really required them working in the same space. For I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks, our team went over there. We had 2 guys go over there working on the data model at night, and then going into the office during the day with Multimatic and kind of working out the details.
If you could just speak to the compromise that you and Ken had to meet and reach to make the car look the way it was designed or as close as possible, and then be competitive, be fast, generate the correct downforce. That compromise had to be incredibly difficult to reach, and I'm sure took lots and lots of work between the 2 departments.
Yes, I mean, the compromise, as you say, it is quite a difficult process. The 2 don't go hand in hand, but as long as both sides have a good understanding of what the other side's trying to achieve, then can make it work. But that's also helped by the way the IMSA works with it in the wind tunnel and the balance of performance that the series has. So you still have some room within the regulations where they're trying to get cars that have the branding built into them to race together side by side. So you have got a little bit of maneuverability in there, but the 2 sides need to work very closely together to understand that if it's totally to the design studio's requirements, but isn't producing the aero numbers, then you can't move forward with it. You have to take on that compromise to be able to develop the car. And in the same way, if we develop something that just doesn't meet the Mazda brand, then we need to work with the studio to work out how to change that to make it so it is part of the Mazda brand.
And then you do all these simulations. Obviously, you speak about them being close to reality for when you unload the RT24-P at Daytona or Sebring or Laguna Seca. How close can you guys get those simulations to what you actually see in real life on the racetrack?
Very close. The performance, both measured data from the wind tunnel, we get very close to reality. We're constantly evolving our processes of design in the wind tunnel and on CFD to evaluate how the car's performing on track in comparison to the data we get from the tunnel and the CFD.
So Ken, yeah, we've heard between all the parties involved that the work that goes into taking that artful design and making it a competitive race car, it isn't easy, but it sure is worth it. You've got to just be proud when you see the RT24Ps, the pair of them, go around tracks, world renowned while racing with IMSA. I have to imagine it's a great feeling personally, where do you draw some of your inspiration from that you bring to these projects for Mazda?
Well, twofold. Yes, it's a big inspiration. I made sure the team joined us at Daytona for that first year to be part of the experience. And for a designer, there's nothing greater than to see your work on the road or on the racetrack. So for the guys, it was very inspiring to be able to like see 6, 8 months worth of work actually, running in anger at Daytona. Um, the inspiration, like I said, for us, it was just to have a successful race car that had the right feel to it, that was dynamic, had a Mazda character to it. Being a motorsports fan and kind of a motorsport historian, I look back on some of the prototypes over the years between some of our early prototypes, 787, some of the prototypes of that era, XJR 15, things like that, that had much more swooping front fender lines. And the trend had been much more blunt, upright front fenders, I guess, to clear the air over the car so you have clean air over the rear wing. But we didn't feel that was a Mazda look. It then tends to be maybe more German and tougher and more tank-like, if you will. So we really pushed for a much more flowing surface and a much more beautiful again. And giving it to the aerodynamicist and the CFD team, they weren't sure at first, but once they did some CFD development, they realized this is actually not a bad way to go, and it's just as effective as putting a much more upright front end on the car. So again, our inspiration is, for me to lead the team, my inspiration was obviously the history of motorsports and some of the successful cars. Some of my guys then went back and looked at some historical Le Mans footage, and we did spend some time looking at YouTube videos and the Audi 24-hour video that was made. That was great, and I made the guys watch that. We had a screen set up in the studio, and then we had that running on a loop. So for them, that was great. So that was their inspiration, some of the history. But then we also knew that we wanted it to be very much a Mazda. And that was all about beautiful surfacing and the Mazda front face.
So you talked about the styling cues of the Mazda RT24-P and having to work hand in hand with the design guys, and most importantly, getting an aerodynamic body that works for what you guys are trying to do in the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. That governing body of IMSA allows DPi teams to have a car on track that very closely resembles the production model of that vehicle. For you guys, it's obviously a Mazda production vehicle. Speaking technically and maybe more specifically in a rules realm with what IMSA allows and expects, what's it like putting together a car that is going to look a little bit like a Mazda, but still has to meet the specifications that IMSA technical regulations allow?
So IMSA technical regulations allow quite a lot of freedom around the car with the view to get those styling cues built into the car. So there's several free boxes around the car that you can adapt and put your styling cues into. That area is quite open. So that allows you to manipulate those surfaces and get performance from them at the same time as getting the styling cues built in from Mazda design.
And then, Ken, before we let you off the hook today and let you get out of here, I'll ask you one more kind of pressure cooker question. As a designer, when you look back on the line of cars that have come through the Mazda doors, whether in your 30 years with the brand or even predating you, when you look back, whether it's production, whether it's race car, maybe both, designer-wise, what's been your favorite Mazda that's been produced?
My favorite Mazda that's been produced is a tough one to answer. We have a lot of great cars in our history. Not avoiding the question, but again, our race cars, our 787, obviously because of the success of it, the iconic graphics of that car. Our 792 GTP car that we had, that was a beautiful design, and that was years ago. That was actually done in house. Obviously, the fourth gen or the FD RX7. I'm a little partial second gen MX5s. I worked on that car. I also raced that in Spec Miata, and then again, most recently, certainly the RT24-P. Not just because we worked on it, but when I see it in context with the other cars in that category, I still feel like we really hit a home run with it as far as just being purely a beautiful design statement. And I have heard from a lot of people who said the same thing, and I've read reviews that it's the most beautiful car on the grid. So that's a great thing to hear from people.
I certainly don't think you're going to hear any objections, certainly not from me or a lot of people, about that being one of, if not the most beautiful car on the grid, whether it's Daytona, whether it's Watkins Glen. It's an incredibly artfully designed race car. And Ken, we really appreciate your time. We appreciate all the hard work you put in to Mazda, as well as the chances you get to add something to Mazda Motorsports. Thanks so much for talking to us, and hopefully we'll see you at a racetrack very soon.
Hey, thanks for having me today. It was good talking with you.